July 26, 1944. Over Munich, Germany, 29,000 feet. Flight Lieutenant A.E. Wall throttled his de Havilland Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft to maximum speed, 380 miles per hour. The fastest operational aircraft in the RAF inventory, the Wooden Wonder could outrun anything the Luftwaffe flew. Wall had performed dozens of high-altitude photo reconnaissance missions over Germany. Standard procedure was simple. If a German fighter appeared, accelerate and leave them behind. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf F-190s couldn't catch a Mosquito at full speed. But something was approaching from behind, fast. Wall pushed the throttles forward. The Mosquito accelerated. The pursuing aircraft didn't fall back. It closed the distance. Wall watched in disbelief as the German fighter pulled alongside, not to attack, but apparently to confirm the Mosquito was Allied. The aircraft had no propeller. Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber of Erprobungskommando 262, Germany's jet fighter test unit, had just made first contact with an Allied aircraft. What happened next would terrify Allied bomber crews for the final 10 months of the war. Schreiber changed position and opened fire. Wall turned sharply. The Mosquito could turn tighter than anything the Germans flew. Schreiber used his speed advantage to reposition. He attacked again. Wall evaded again. This continued 4 more times: attack, evasion, repositioning. Finally, Schreiber attempted an attack from beneath. Wall dove at full speed into clouds below and escaped to Italy. The encounter electrified RAF intelligence. A German fighter had matched the Mosquito's speed. Not just matched, exceeded it, by at least 100 miles per hour. 2 weeks later, on August 8th, another Mosquito wasn't so lucky. Lieutenant Joachim Weber of E-Kondo 262 intercepted a photo reconnaissance Mosquito over Munich and shot it down, killing Flight Lieutenant Desmond Lawrence Matthewman and Flight Sergeant William Stopford. The jet age had arrived in combat, and Allied bomber crews were about to learn that air superiority was no longer guaranteed.
Allied intelligence had known about German jet development since 1943. Photo reconnaissance had captured images of strange aircraft at Messerschmitt facilities. Agents reported rumors of pilotless fighters powered by rockets or jets. The reports seemed exaggerated, almost fantastical. American bomber crews dismissed the intelligence warnings. By summer 1944, Allied air superiority over Germany was absolute. Thousands of American heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators struck German industrial targets daily, escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. German fighter opposition had collapsed. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots were dead. Fuel shortages grounded much of what remained. The few German fighters that rose to challenge the bombers' streams were systematically destroyed. Victory seemed inevitable. The war would be over by Christmas. Then the jets appeared. August 28, 1944. Near Brussels, Belgium, Major Joseph Myers and Lieutenant Manfred Croy Jr. of the 78th Fighter Group spotted an Me-262 at low altitude. They attacked immediately, shooting it down before the German pilot could accelerate to his aircraft's maximum speed. This was the first Me-262 destroyed by American fighters. But Myers and Croy had caught the jet at its most vulnerable moment, low and slow, unable to use its overwhelming speed advantage. In the air, at combat speed, the Me-262 was untouchable. By January 1945, Jagdgeschwader 7 was formed as a pure jet fighter wing. During March, Me-262 fighter units were able, for the first time, to mount large-scale attacks on Allied bomber formations. What happened next would become the most terrifying experience Allied bomber crews faced in the entire war.
The Messerschmitt Me-262 Swallow represented a technological leap that made every Allied fighter obsolete overnight. Maximum speed, 540 miles per hour. The P-51 Mustang, America's best fighter, topped out at 440 miles per hour. The P-47 Thunderbolt, 433 miles per hour. The British Spitfire, 440 miles per hour. The Me-262 was 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies could field. That speed advantage translated into tactical invincibility. An Me-262 pilot could choose when to engage and when to disengage. Allied fighters couldn't catch jets that didn't want to fight. They couldn't pursue jets that accelerated away. They couldn't force jets into turning dogfights where American numerical superiority mattered. Luftwaffe Me-262 pilots claimed a total of 542 Allied air-to-air victories in their deployment from April 1944 to May 1945, despite the jets never numbering more than a few dozen operational aircraft at any given time. The armament was devastating. Four 30mm Mk-108 cannons, mounted in the nose, fired explosive rounds that could rip a heavy bomber apart with a single burst. Unlike the American .50 caliber machine guns that required sustained fire to bring down a bomber, the Me-262's cannons destroyed targets with shocking efficiency. German pilots developed new tactics specifically for jet combat. Attack from above and behind at maximum speed, fire a burst, accelerate through the bomber formation before Allied escort fighters could react, climb back to altitude, repeat. American fighter pilots were helpless. They couldn't climb fast enough to intercept. They couldn't accelerate fast enough to pursue. They could only watch as jets tore through bomber formations, destroying aircraft at will, then vanishing before anyone could respond. On September 1, 1944, USAF General Karl Spaatz expressed the fear that if greater numbers of German jets appeared, they could inflict losses heavy enough to force cancellation of the Allied bombing offensive by daylight. The strategic implications were catastrophic. The entire Allied bombing campaign, the systematic destruction of German industry that was supposed to end the war, faced cancellation. If Germany could mass-produce jets, Allied bomber losses would become unsustainable. Daylight bombing would stop, the strategic air offensive would collapse. Everything depended on keeping German jet numbers low.
On 6 November 1944, Captain Chuck Yeager saw a Me-262 for the first time. That day, Yeager's group was returning from a mission to Germany, escorting B-24s that had bombed factories near Minden. Yeager, who would later become the first pilot to break the sound barrier, was leading cement white flight when he spotted 3 Me-262s approaching. The fighters were escorting B-24 Liberator heavy bombers near Minden, Germany. When the Me-262s arrived in force, the Mustang men were ready for them. One jet fired at Yeager and missed. As it hurtled past, Yeager realized something critical. The Me-262 was fast in a straight line, but couldn't turn quickly. And, more importantly, he'd heard intelligence reports about jet bases near the area. Yeager made a decision that would define jet combat tactics for the rest of the war. Instead of pursuing the jets, impossible, he flew toward the nearest Luftwaffe airfield at Ockmer. Jets had to land somewhere, and when they landed, they were vulnerable. He arrived over Ockmer at 20,000 feet. Below, an Me-262 was on final approach, gear down, flaps extended, speed reduced for landing. The jet was helpless. Yeager later wrote in his combat report, "First time I saw a jet, I shot it down. I was first in my group to shoot down an Me-262. He was on final, not very sportsmanlike, but what the hell." The tactic was brutal. It was unsportsmanlike. It was also the only way propeller-driven fighters could reliably kill jets. Allied intelligence immediately distributed new tactical guidance to all fighter groups. Don't chase jets in the air. Attack them on the ground or during takeoff and landing. The strategy became known as rat-catching among American pilots. Luftwaffe Me-262 bases became the most dangerous airspace in Germany, not because of jets, but because of Allied fighter patrols orbiting endlessly above runways waiting for jets to land. Allied pilots soon found that the only reliable way to destroy the jets was to attack them on the ground or during takeoff or landing. As the Me-262A's pioneering Junkers Jumo 004 axial flow jet engines needed careful nursing by their pilots, these jet aircraft were particularly vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The jet engines were temperamental. Pilots couldn't advance throttles quickly. Rapid throttle movements caused compressor stalls and flameouts. During takeoff, jets accelerated slowly, vulnerable to attack. During landing, they had to reduce speed significantly, making them easy targets for American fighters flying top cover overhead. The Luftwaffe responded desperately. The Luftwaffe countered by installing extensive flak alleys of anti-aircraft guns along the approach lines to protect the Me-262s from the ground, and by providing top cover during the jet's takeoff and landing with the most advanced Luftwaffe single-engine fighters, the Focke-Wulf FW910D. But the situation was impossible. Germany was simultaneously trying to defend jet bases with fighters that should have been attacking Allied bombers. Valuable FW-190s that could have intercepted bomber formations were instead flying defensive patrols over airfields, protecting jets during their most vulnerable moments. American fighter groups adapted quickly. They identified jet bases through reconnaissance and maintained standing patrols. Every Me-262 that took off faced American fighters waiting overhead. Every Me-262 returning from a mission faced the same gauntlet. On November 8, 1944, Major Walter Novotny, Germany's jet ace with 258 total victories, was shot down and killed during combat near Akmer Airfield. The exact circumstances remain disputed, but the most credible evidence suggests American P-51 pilot Edward Hayden caught Novotny during landing approach when the jet was slow and vulnerable. The Kommando Novotny unit, Germany's first operational jet fighter formation, was disbanded shortly after its commander's death. The unit claimed 22 Allied aircraft shot down in exchange for 26 Me-262s before the commando was withdrawn. The kill ratio was devastating, but not the way Germany needed. Jets were supposed to dominate. Instead, they were dying at nearly equal rates to the aircraft they shot down.
The March 18, 1945 raid on Berlin included more than 1,220 Allied bombers and scores of North American P-51 Mustang fighters contending with heavy German flak and tangling with fast-flying German Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters employing air-to-air rockets operationally for the first time. It would be the last great air battle of the European War. The American 457th Bomber Group assembled over London in early morning sunlight. More than 1,220 heavy bombers prepared to strike Berlin. The Luftwaffe knew they were coming. Oberleutnant Gunther Wiegmann commanded the 9th Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 7. His Me-262s carried a new weapon, R4M unguided rockets. Each jet carried 24 rockets, each capable of destroying a heavy bomber with a single hit. Wiegmann led his squadron in a loose formation toward the incoming bombers. He and his two wingmen fired their R4M rockets into one tight formation of some 60 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers from a distance of 3,000 feet. The rockets tore through the bomber formation. B-17s exploded. Others fell out of formation, trailing smoke and flame. Pilots desperately tried to maintain formation discipline while jets attacked from impossible angles at impossible speeds. American fighter escorts engaged immediately, but the jets were too fast. They fired, accelerated through the formation, climbed back to altitude, and attacked again. P-51 pilots tried to intercept, but arrived seconds too late. The jets were already gone, repositioning for another attack run. The battle was chaos. Hundreds of aircraft filled the sky over Berlin. Flak explosions created black clouds throughout the bomber formations. Jets streaked through at 500 miles per hour. American fighters desperately tried to protect the bombers, but they were fighting an enemy that could appear and disappear at will. When the bomber stream finally cleared German airspace, the losses were staggering. The Me-262s had inflicted catastrophic damage in their most effective combat deployment of the entire war. But it was also one of their last major operations. By March 1945, Germany was collapsing. Fuel shortages were critical. Trained pilots were scarce. Allied armies were approaching Berlin from east and west. The jets had arrived too late.
The Me-262 was prone to engine failures, and its landing gear frequently collapsed. It performed sluggishly in the airfield pattern while taking off or landing. The Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines were technological marvels and mechanical nightmares. A 262 jet engine would typically wear out after just 10 to 20 flight hours and would need to be replaced or repaired with parts that weren't always widely available. 20 flight hours. Most reciprocating engines in American fighters lasted hundreds of hours between overhauls. The Me-262's engines needed replacement after the equivalent of 4 or 5 combat missions. Germany lacked the high-temperature alloys necessary for reliable jet engines. Engineers were forced to use inferior materials that couldn't withstand the extreme temperatures and stresses of jet propulsion. Engines failed regularly. Some exploded in flight. Others suffered compressor stalls that killed the engine instantly, leaving pilots gliding a 30-ton aircraft toward enemy territory with no power. Toward the end of the war, Me-262s were often towed to the end of the runway by draft horses in order to conserve fuel. The image captures Germany's desperation perfectly. The world's most advanced fighter aircraft pulled to the runway by horses because Germany had no fuel for ground vehicles. Even when jets had fuel and working engines, tactical limitations remained crippling. The Me-262, when compared to other fighters at the time, was not an agile airframe. It lacked agility, acceleration, and climb, all things a fighter needed when engaged in air combat. American fighter pilots learned quickly. Fighter pilots learned the Me-262 had to slow down to take a turn, and the much more maneuverable Mustangs would be ready when it did. The tactic was simple: force the jet to turn, wait for it to decelerate, kill it while it's slow. P-51 Mustangs began flying in tight box formations of 4 aircraft. If a jet attacked, the formation could, reportedly, prevent the jet from evading. At least one P-51 would always have a shot when the jet maneuvered. One Allied trick was nitric oxide injection, similar to the Germans' own GM-1 fuel injection system, which gave them a quick burst of speed to close and fire on the jets. The Americans adapted. They learned. They developed tactics that neutralized German advantages, and critically, they had resources Germany lacked: fuel, trained pilots, replacement aircraft, and time.
Although some 1,433 Messerschmitt Me-262 fighters were delivered, only about 300 saw combat. There were probably never more than 36 in the air at a time when the Allies customarily put 1,000 bombers and 1,000 fighters over the ruins of Germany. The numbers tell the story. Germany built 1,433 revolutionary fighters, but only 300 ever flew combat missions. Most sat on airfields, waiting for engines that never arrived, or for fuel that didn't exist, or for pilots who had been killed in training. On any given day in early 1945, the Luftwaffe might have 30 operational Messerschmitt Me-262s. The Americans put 1,000 bombers and 1,000 fighters over Germany daily. The numerical disparity was insurmountable. The real tragedy, from Germany's perspective, wasn't that the Me-262 failed. The tragedy was that it arrived too late to matter. Had the Air Ministry done its job, The Messerschmitt Me-262 could have been in operation in great numbers by 1943, and the Allies would not have won the air superiority that made the June 6, 1944 D-Day invasion possible. The aircraft first flew with jet engines in July 1942. Production didn't begin until 1944. That two-year gap was fatal. If Me-262s had appeared in force in 1943, when Germany still had fuel, trained pilots, and industrial capacity, the entire strategic bombing campaign would have faced collapse. D-Day might have been postponed or canceled. The war would have been prolonged. But Adolf Hitler personally interfered with Me-262 development, insisting it be redesigned as a fighter-bomber rather than a pure interceptor. Months were wasted modifying the design to carry bombs it would rarely drop effectively. Meanwhile, American bomber formations grew larger, and Allied fighter escorts grew more numerous. By the time Me-262s entered combat in significant numbers, early 1945, Germany was finished. Allied armies were crossing the Rhine. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin. German industry was destroyed. Fuel production had collapsed. The Luftwaffe had no way to train new jet pilots. The Me-262 was restricted by engine problems, primarily caused by a low operational life due to metal fatigue of low-quality metals used in the Jumo 004 turbojet, fuel shortages, and Allied attacks on their air bases. The Me-262 didn't lose because it was a bad aircraft. It lost because Germany couldn't sustain it operationally against an enemy with overwhelming resources. After the war, Chuck Yeager was selected as a test pilot. On October 14, 1947, he became the first person to break the sound barrier in level flight, flying the Bell X-1 rocket plane. He'd learned about high-speed flight the hard way, chasing German jets that were faster than anything he flew. Those experiences shaped his understanding of transonic flight and prepared him for the X-1 program. American jet development accelerated dramatically after World War II, heavily influenced by captured German technology. The F-86 Sabre, America's first swept-wing jet fighter, incorporated aerodynamic lessons learned from Me-262 research. It would dominate the skies over Korea in the 1950s. The Soviet Union's MiG-15 was even more directly influenced by German jet technology. Soviet engineers literally copied German swept-wing designs and turbojet engines captured in 1945. Britain's jet program, which had actually preceded Germany's in fundamental research, accelerated rapidly post-war. The Gloucester Meteor had been operational simultaneously with the Me-262, but never encountered German jets in combat. By the 1950s, every major air force flew jets exclusively. Propeller-driven fighters were obsolete. The revolution the Me-262 had started was complete. But the men who had fought the first jet war, Allied bomber crews and fighter pilots who'd faced the Svalbard over Germany in 1944 and 1945, never forgot the terror of watching jets tear through bomber formations at impossible speeds. For 10 months, from August 44 to May 45, Allied pilots learned that air superiority could be challenged by technology, that numerical advantage could be neutralized by speed, that victory required adaptation, innovation, and ruthless tactical evolution. They stopped laughing when the jets appeared. They learned to respect an enemy weapon that was genuinely superior. And then they learned to beat it anyway, not through superior technology, but through superior tactics, overwhelming numbers, and relentless pressure on German logistics and infrastructure. The Me-262 swept Allied fighters from the skies for brief, terrifying moments. But it couldn't sweep Allied armies from Europe, couldn't restore German fuel production, couldn't train replacement pilots faster than they died, and couldn't arrive early enough to change the war's outcome. It was the most dangerous fighter in the sky, and it didn't matter.
That paradox defines the Me-262's legacy. A revolutionary weapon that arrived too late, fielded by a nation that lacked resources to sustain it, fighting an enemy that adapted faster than Germany could innovate. The jets came too late. The war was already over. Germany just hadn't surrendered yet.